Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our study of the Gilded Age by looking at the growth of urban political machines. This is a topic that we've already sort of talked about, and Mark Twain sort of captures the oeuvre of the age with his revised catechism. So I'll give you a minute to take that in, and then we'll move on to talk about how these political machines, which started in the pre-Civil War era, greatly expanded during the Gilded Age to both address and cause some of the major problems that are going to define the issue. So pause, take this in, let's move on. Here are our objectives for today. Take a moment, take them in, and let's continue moving. Here's the basic description of why these political machines became necessary. As it says, we started to see mass production, people living in close proximity to each other, increasing urbanization, leading to a whole host of problems that could no longer be solved by the sort of individualistic and informal networks that had been created. These urban problems required a much more complex solution, and these solutions came in the form of larger municipal governments controlled by urban political machines. These political machines now controlled vast amounts of money flowing through the political system of the United States as tax revenue in urban areas continued to increase, and they used this sort of hierarchical structure to both ensure their own place in power, but also provide some needed social services for people that were necessary. We see a significant amount of dependence on these political machines, so take a moment and pause and read about aldermen. And we'll continue to move on. The prototypical political boss of this time period is William Tweed. William, or Boss Tweed, controlled the political machine of Tammany Hall in New York City. And as this Thomas Nast cartoon shows, he had an outsized amount of power and control over his political arena. He generally did not hold a position of power himself. In order to shield himself from accountability, he generally resided in the state senate, but it was very clear that he was the, quote, power behind the throne in New York City, but this informal network allowed him to avoid accountability whenever anyone came asking about corruption or a variety of other issues occurring within New York City. As you can see here, this explains how these political machines both provided services and also how they kept themselves in power. So take a moment to read both of these, and then we'll move on. One of the main things that these political machines provided was a social safety net. This was a world before welfare, before unemployment insurance, before any of these sort of things. The world of the urban industrialized United States was relatively cutthroat, and it wouldn't take much for a family to find themselves living on the margins and without much extra. And so because of that, as you see, quote, if a family is burned out, I don't ask if they're Republicans or Democrats, and I don't refer to them to a charitable organization society, which would investigate their case in a month or two and decide if they were worthy of help about the time they're dead from starvation. I just get up quarters for them, buy clothes for them if their clothes were burned up, and fix them up until they get things running again. It's philanthropy, but it's politics too. Mighty good politics. Who can tell how many votes one of these fires brings me? And so, in addition to the spectacular amount of corruption, we also see a measure of protection for the citizens and constituents of these political machines, providing needed aid at times, and then, of course, demanding votes in exchange. At the same time, we see a spectacular amount of corruption and graft, both corruption within the voting process, using voter intimidation, voter fraud, describes here, quote, the assessor pads the list with names of dead dogs, children, and non-existent persons. One newspaper printed the picture of a dog and another of that of a 5-year-old Negro boy down on such a list. The repeat voting is done boldly, for the machine controls the election officers, often choosing them from among fraudulent names, and when no one appears to sever, assigning the healer ready for the expected vacancy. The police are forbidden by law to stand within 30 feet of the polls, but they are there at the box and there to see that the machine's orders are obeyed. Because, of course, who pays and appoints the police? The political machine. And so by controlling all the levers of government, the political machines are able to dominate politics and prevent any opposition from rising against them. These political machines also exist not just to help people and to stay in power, but to steal spectacular amounts of money. This is often done through graft. This graft is generally very difficult to detect because, for example, one way that political machines make money is by substantially inflating the cost of providing basic government services. For example, they need a new courthouse, and so they put on the books that this staircase costs $3.5 million. They then get the stairhouse for the new courthouse. They then get a carpenter to build it for whatever it costs to build it. They toss him a couple $1,000s for his trouble, and then they pocket the extra money. On paper, everything looks fine, but in reality, they bought a staircase for way more than it's worth, and most of that money went into the pockets of these corrupt politicians. We also see some significant insider trading, or as William Reardon called it, said in Plunkett of Tammany Hall, honest graft. So take a moment to read this, and then we'll move on. In general, these political machines were very difficult to respond to. Americans struggled to find adequate responses to them. There were some honest politicians that went on to take on these political machines. For example, Sam Tilden of New York did try to take on Tammany Hall. But the end result was that he, when he ran for president, lost the support of Tammany Hall and therefore lost the election. You have some people like Grover Cleveland who try to reform the merit system, and you have the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which attempted to do that. But bribery can get around these things. And you had some honest politicians like Theodore Roosevelt, who, when he was police commissioner, would walk the streets of New York City to ensure that his cops were doing their job and following the law. But in general, all of these responses depended on specifically virtuous men who were pushing to enforce the law, and not institutional controls. And it's because it relied on these specific men. When they left the position, there was nothing stopping a corrupt person from going in and bringing back all of the corruption. And so none of these reforms turned out to be specifically lasting. Tammany Hall, or at least Boss Tweed himself, because Tammany Hall would continue until after World War II, Boss Tweed himself was brought down by Thomas Nast, who was a political cartoonist, who made it his goal to paint Boss Tweed as a spectacularly corrupt politician, metaphorically, or literally in this case, feasting on the corpse of New York City. It eventually led to Boss Tweed getting arrested, but he bribed his way out of jail and fled. Here we see him being too big to jail. And eventually he did fall from power, but the political machine that he created carried on, another boss took over, and the system continued to propagate itself. So Thomas Nast was able to take down Boss Tweed, but was not able to take down the massive amount of corruption that Boss Tweed represented. We do see at the state level there being some reformers. Chester A. Arthur, of course, just handed out patronage jobs to anyone, but the Pendleton Civil Service Act attempted to reform that, and in later years it would be enforced. We saw politicians like Bob La Follette of Wisconsin pushing things like referendum, where voters individually can go vote on laws, and recall, which could allow them to have another election to pull office holders who are corrupt out of office. And these reforms were passed at the state level, but there wasn't a lot of national entrenchment. And again, it required specific individuals like Bob La Follette who made this their cause in order to push these things. And there was really nothing preventing the status quo from re-exerting itself when Bob La Follette or someone else leaves office. So the election of 1888, Grover Cleveland, Big Steve, is going to run for re-election. There's a number of different issues here. We're starting to see an increasing push for bimetallism or for increased greenbacks. Generally, people who are in debt want to increase the money supply in order to make their debts easier to pay off. This is going to be one of the central issues throughout the Gilded Age, is staying on the gold standard versus increasing coinage of silver. And it's really going to take off in the 1890s once the Populist Party starts getting going, but that's for another lesson. So Grover Cleveland is going to be a big fan of the gold standard or sound money. And at the same time, he's also going to try to lower tariffs, because Cleveland's massive cutting of government spending is going to lead to a massive government surplus, which was getting kind of embarrassing at this point that the federal government had so much money sitting around. So Cleveland argued we could take down protective tariffs in order to cut down on our surplus revenue and make goods cheaper for individuals. Unfortunately for Cleveland, two things happened. One, the Republicans were able to paint him as anti-industry, anti-worker, because, of course, his free trade message means that American workers now have to compete more directly with British ones. And so he alienated industrialists and industrial workers, which are an increasing share of the electorate at this point. And his failure to play ball with Tammany Hall led to the political machine in New York not supporting him. And so he loses his home state of New York, and the election's and that provides a basically impossible electoral victory for him. The Republicans are going to double down on nominating kind of worthless presidential candidates. Roscoe Conkling here is finally going to get his favorite candidate, Benjamin Harrison, to run for president. Benjamin Harrison is the grandson of William Henry Harrison, and they often show him wearing his grandfather's hat, because William Henry Harrison is such a towering figure in American politics. And he, despite the attempts of reformers, is going to double down on patronage, double down on the spoils system, and basically double down on the status quo. So here is the Republican Party sacrificing civil service reform to the god of patronage. Here's Benjamin Harrison, for some reason dressed as a gladiator at this point, performing the sacrifice. And the end result is that big business is going to love him. They're going to push for high protective tariffs, backed by William McKinley. You might want to remember his name. He's going to become important later. And industrialists and workers are going to support the Republicans in huge numbers, some because they like their policies, and some because, again, massive corruption, and they don't want to get fired. So your end result is this: Cleveland loses his home state of New York. The election looks shockingly like the election of 1880, and the Republicans are swept back into office. What does this mean for Benjamin Harrison? It means he's going to more or less be a puppet of the Republican establishment. Throughout the rest of his presidency, political cartoons are going to increasingly mock him, showing him smaller and smaller, with his grandfather's hat bigger and bigger. Here's James Blaine threatening to either run or ruin his administration if he doesn't give him key government jobs, which, again, awesome. Under Harrison, we're going to see a massive strike in the Carnegie steel plant. Carnegie, as you remember, was the supposed lovable industrialist who preached the gospel of wealth. But it turns out when his workers go on strike because they're raising raising living conditions in his factory town, while not raising wages, the workers are going to seize control and shut it down. There's going to be a super embarrassing standoff where the Pinkertons attack the workers on a barge, and we have a spectacular battle between the two sides. And eventually, federal troops under Harrison are called in to put the whole strike down, fire all the workers, and replace them with more pliable substitutes. And so this again raises the question of the benefits of people having spectacular amounts of money, and is Carnegie truly an altruistic businessman, or is he the same type of cutthroat industrialist that we expect, J.P. Morgan to be? So that brings us to a close for today. This is a lesson on urban political machines. For next time, we're going to leave the North behind, and we're going to head out to the West. And in the West, we're going to start exploring how industrialization and westward expansion is going to transform the Western landscape of the United States, and then start looking at the effects and results of these developments. Thank you for listening.